Whoa. I'm telling you, that's crazy. That was crazy. Let you get back in here. I know there's a bit of folks. We're going to have to cut this first chunk off later. Man. There's someone. I'm not sure who's in. Someone has joined the room. This is this kind of morning where you can't, for some reason, things don't work like they're supposed to work. But we're getting you back. We're getting folks back in. Hopefully, Eric, Rainier, D, hopefully you're coming back in. You're getting back on the channel after the faux pas this morning. The problem that YouTube, I'm blaming it on YouTube, guys. I'm blaming it on YouTube, the YouTubes. So welcome back in. Welcome back in. Again, if you're just joining, we're not going to go in deep depth in the news today. There's the Babers. Welcome back in. Hopefully we'll get everybody else back in. So we're not going deep into the news today. The news is all in the show notes. So the links to the news is all in the show notes. So again, that's a new NAT firewall bypass attack lets attackers access any TCP UDP service. Charming Kitten, our friends from Iran. APT launched spoofed attacks against key personalities. TrickBot rises from the ashes after Microsoft beat it up a little bit, knocked it down. Google patches a second Chrome 0-day in 2 weeks. Malicious NPM packages open backdoors to programmers' computers. Cyber criminals target naked Zoom users. Don't do that, guys. And Oracle publishes a rare out-of-band security update for WebLogic servers. That's your news. If you want to check out any of those stories, they're obviously in the show notes below. They're there for you. Today, it is November 3rd. It's the day to get out and vote. So get out to vote. Looks like we got 3 back. Hopefully that's Eric, Rainier, and D. I know D's there. She's told me she's there. I need a little bit more of the illy coffee. So let folks get in for a second. While I fill my cup up so that we can roll through control tailoring. So control tailoring is an important part of the RMF. It's one of the most important parts of the RMF, really, because this is how we determine where the controls are going to go. So if you're here yesterday, we talked about changing the format up a little bit to serve you, the viewer, better. So what we're going to look at, let's get remember, go and vote. Figure out where you got to vote. Sometimes you can even do late registration. I don't know. We know where ours is. I've got to get to the poll myself today. We got some stuff we got to do. Rainier's here. Good morning yet again. And hopefully the third one is Eric. Looks like problems going back and forth. So yeah, this morning, we're talking about the Risk Management Framework, RMF, or RMF 2.0. This is a live session. So if you're on the live session, don't be afraid to ask questions as we go along. If something doesn't seem right, if something piques your interest, you're like, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, that's the time to ask. So strap in. We're going to be talking about control tailoring. It's part of the select step of RMF 2.0. We got rid of the numbers, and obviously we are using just the names now. So this is part of C3, I think. Yeah, C3. Or S3, excuse me. S3, selection. This is part of the select step, S3. Let me get my numbers right, and we'll be good. So let's get the slideshow set up. I'm going to move myself over yonder. Do not be afraid to ask as we go around. Ask questions as we go through this process, because we'll be going fairly in-depth on a slide deck that normally takes an hour to get through. We're going to kind of chug through it to hopefully move through it at a little better pace. So let's jump in. Let's take me off the screen so we can talk about this task. The RMF cap task S3, control tailoring, and this is an addendum. And what we don't talk about is that NIST does a terrible job when they explain this thing, right? When they talk about this. Why is it? There we go. That's much better. In NIST Special Publication 837, Revision 2, Control Tailoring. Well, you've seen you may have seen the video. There's a video already out on Cyber-Recon talking through this task, and it doesn't really tell you how to do the control tailoring. How in the heck do you do this thing? So, in this video, we're going to talk about how in the heck you do this task. All right, so let's jump in. What's that sound? As Van Halen used to say. So, let's think about. I am going to put myself back on the screen. Put myself back up here. I'm going to change the shape. Picture. I'll be the round dude. So, we talk about control tailoring. Let me get my directions right. So we talk about control tailoring. We have to start with the baseline. And the baseline you're normally going to start with is going to be like 100 controls, right? But to walk through 100 controls in this session wouldn't make any sense. So what we've done is we're going to start with this very, very limited control set. So we're going to say, we're going to pretend, we're going to enter the world of make-believe, and we're going to pretend that this is the entirety of our control baseline. This is all the controls that we're given when we're given the baseline for our system, right? So there's not a ton of controls here. Now think about it. Normally you're going to have well over 100 controls you have to implement. So we have to think as a system owner, that's a daunting task. So let's figure out how many of these controls we can tailor and how many belong to someone else, right? So some of these are going to be inherited. So hopefully that makes all sense. That makes sense? We're going to get thumbs up. We understand a control baseline. We get that through the steps of the RMF to this point by categorizing the system, by categorizing the information types, and then determining the type of baseline selection our organization uses. So it may be defined by the organization, or it may be defined by a baseline that's set maybe by someone else, the federal government, NIST, or a community, right? So let's look at what we've got here, right? So where's my mouse? There we go. I hate when you lose your mouse. That's the worst thing. So I'm going to get myself off the screen. Okay. So the control set we're working with here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 controls. So we have 15 controls we're going to work with as we tailor this baseline. And think about this. That's about probably 1/10 of really what you're going to have to do when you tailor an actual baseline as you go through this thing. So we're going to throw this into an SCTM. And an SCTM, or a Security Controls Traceability Matrix, and I guess that's going to have to change since we're just going to go to the term controls now. So it'd be probably a Controls Traceability Matrix, is going to define the control number, the control name, and then a space for tailoring and a space for rationale. So don't get freaked out. This is just an Excel spreadsheet. That's all this is. It's going to allow us to document how we're tailoring each of these controls. Remember, there's about 15 controls on here that we've got to deal with at this point. So 15 controls to work with. So, tailoring activities. It's the application of the appropriate scoping guidance to the initial baseline. So that's our 15 controls. That's our initial baseline. The specification of compensating security controls if they're needed, and we'll get to that later in the deck. The specification of organizationally defined parameters in the security controls where allowed, and we'll get to that. So each of these tasks, we're going to break the tasks down into chunks, and then we're going to actually go through and do them. So, okay. So, scoping guidance. So, Examples of scoping guidance are use of common controls, physical and infrastructure related considerations, which sometimes those are thrown in the bucket of common controls as well, and then technology related considerations. And some examples of actions we're going to do in this part is it does not apply or it can be downgraded, right? So those are some of the things we're going to think about as we start driving through this step, or this part of the task, I should say. So there's operational and environmental related considerations we have to think about. Sometimes a control is dependent on nature. So for example, a remote sensor. We have to review each control for environmental considerations. So this will get faster over time. This first time through is going to be painful. As you go through your first tailoring exercise, it's going to be a little bit painful because you have to think about each and every control as we go through each and every one of these steps. But it'll get faster because you'll realize while we say we have to go through each and every control, sometimes we'll know that these considerations don't apply to specific controls, right? Like a policy and procedure. We can throw all the -1s out because they're not dependent on nature. So review each control for environmental concerns and identify those controls that are not applicable. So some controls will be not applicable based on an environmental or an operational related consideration. So here's when we're going to start tailoring our control set, right? So we have a control. It's from the physical and environmental category, of that family. It's PE14. It's temperature and humidity controls. And in this case, we're going to call it a component level tailoring. We're going to tailor this as a component because we're only tailoring out a component of our system that will not implement this. So our rationale, we got to define rationale so that the security control assessor and the authorizing official know why we're tailoring this control out. So operational and environmental related consideration is the title we're giving it, and then we're going to define it. The temperature and humidity controls do not apply to remote sensors implemented in the information system. So we have some remote sensors. They may be out, maybe they sit in the water, right? So maybe they sit in, they're a sensor that sits in the water and they look for some sonar signal or something, right? So it's a sensor, and we know it's going to be in the water, so maybe we know we're not going to put temperature and humidity controls on it. It just doesn't make sense. So we're tailoring that out for that specific component of our system. For the rest of the system, we'll put our temperature and humidity controls in place. So that's the first thing we think about. Now the second thing we're thinking about are technology-related considerations. These are controls that refer to a specific technology that are only applicable when that technology is employed. So, for example, a good one we think of is wireless technology. We don't have to put many of the wireless controls in if we're not using wireless technology, right? So we still have to have things like policy and procedure. We still have to look for unauthorized wireless, but a lot of the controls around wireless we don't have to implement if our system can't do wireless. Now, these can be assigned to a subsystem that has the technology if it's unique, so maybe only one part of our system, one workstation has wireless in that example. And automate this if possible, and then identify those controls that are not applicable. So we go back to our control set. We have two controls here, SC12 and SC13. The first one is cryptographic key establishment and management. And for tailoring, we're going to flat out say this does not apply. So the rationale that we're giving to the security control assessor and the authorizing official is the information system does not employ cryptography. So if we don't employ cryptography, that's the technology, right? So this is a technology-related consideration. We don't use cryptography, so we don't have cryptographic key establishment and management. We don't have that because we don't have that technology. The second one, SC13, use of cryptography, we're going to say that doesn't apply as well. And again, we're going to say this is a technology-related consideration. The information system does not employ cryptography. So for whatever reason, we're not putting cryptography on the system. So these two controls, already they're out. So now we're down to 13 controls. We're dropping our number because we're saying, hey, these don't apply. So now let's think about physical and infrastructure related considerations. Now, these are physical controls that may be provided by the hosting environment. Again, this is a good example of when we throw in, a lot of times, common controls. So think of things like lighting, temperature controls, environmental controls, physical security controls like the gates, guns, and guards. And we already kind of talked about one of these, right? Temperature controls, we already looked at a temperature control, and we tailored out it at the component level. So at the component level of the remote sensors, we're not doing the temperature and humidity monitoring at all. But here we're going to look at it at the rest of the system. These are implemented as common controls and can only be inherited from approved common control sets, right? So we have to have an approved common control set before we can inherit them. If the common control is not sufficient, additional measures can be implemented at the system level, resulting in a hybrid control. So for example, if the physical security standards provided by the building don't provide the adequate level of security for our system, maybe we'll employ biometric locks on the doors leading into our office. That's an example where we'd use the physical security provided by the building, and then we'd add additional security at the system level, at the room level where the system is housed. So we have to identify the controls that are not applicable because they're coming from a common control provider, or those controls that are also hybrid. So we can go back to our control set. Now, again, I'm only bringing pieces of the control set up when we look at this because it becomes unwieldy on a PowerPoint. On the display here, it's really hard to look at all of this at one time. So we're looking at these controls here. So we have PE14, temperature and humidity controls. This tailoring was at the component level. We already talked about that, right? Now let's talk about PE15, water damage protection. So in this case, we're saying it's a hybrid control, and it's also a component level control. So we're saying this time physical infrastructure related consideration. So water damage is provided to the portions of the information system that are housed within the data center. So we're saying those systems within the data center, we're going to inherit those controls. We're also saying the remote sensors are designed to withstand water damage and do not need to implement PE15. So we're saying for those remote sensors that we talked about earlier, we're tailoring this control totally out. And for those systems that are in the data center, we're going to inherit this control from that control set, that common control provider. All right. So that makes sense so far. Hopefully that makes sense. You guys are picking up what I'm laying down. The next consideration we need to think about is public access related considerations. So public access systems must be considered carefully and applied discretion. For example, publicly accessible web pages. So when we think about these things that are publicly accessible, what parts of our system may be publicly accessible? Maybe there's none, but this is a consideration we have to think about all these controls. Identify those controls that are not applicable because of a public access related consideration. So this time we're talking about IA4. It's in our control set, and we're saying identifier management. We're tailoring out the component level. So that means we're not tailoring it for the entire system. We're just tailoring it out for a specific component, and that component will be defined in the rationale. So in the rationale, again, we tell what type of consideration it is. It's a public access related consideration. And then we explain why we're tailoring it out at this component level. So the requirement for a security control identifier does not apply to those information system users that are accessing the public website to obtain publicly available information. So we're telling the AO and the SCA, Security Control Assessor, that when you go to look at the public website, understand we're not putting IA4 identifier management in place. If you go to test that control there, it's going to fail because it's not there. We know this is a public website. We don't want people to have to log in to get publicly available information. So this will go to the AO. The AO will approve the tailoring of this whole set when it's done. And this tells the SCA, don't bother looking at that because we didn't put it in place there. And that hopefully the AO has approved this tailoring. So other things we have to think about: policy or regulatory related considerations. Those controls that only apply when the policy law for guidance applies to the information system or the information on that system, and identify those controls that are not applicable. Again, we're seeing what's applicable, what's not applicable, and which, later we're going to figure out what we need to add to, right? So this time we're going back to AC3. So AC3, FIPS 140 does not apply. So this is a policy and regulatory related consideration. And we're saying encryption of stored information is not employed as an access enforcement mechanism. Therefore, FIPS 140-2 as amended does not apply. So what we're saying here is, it goes back to when we're talking about encryption. This is why we didn't encrypt the system. So we're not encrypting, we're not employing encryption as an access enforcement mechanism. Encryption is not being employed on the system. So this AC3, this requirement for FIPS 140 doesn't apply because we're not doing encryption at all. So this is a regulatory policy related. It's not required that we encrypt the system. So since we're not encrypting, an encryption at FIPS 140-2 isn't required. So it doesn't apply. So we're tailoring another control out. So now we're on to security objective related considerations. Remember, our security objectives are confidentiality, integrity, and availability, our CIA triad. So when we see that, when we see security objective, that's what we think about, CIA. So controls that are unique to confidentiality, integrity, or availability may be selectively downgraded, that's a mistake there, to a lower baseline only if, these three things, it's consistent with the security category for supported security objectives of confidentiality, integrity, and availability before moving to the system's impact level. So when we think back to when we categorize the system, each information type had a security objective rating of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then we rolled those up, and that became the system level, and then we determined the high water mark. So maybe we had low, low, high, and because our availability was high, that made every control high at the high level, the high water mark. So that could be a problem because maybe we have a control that's high for confidentiality and low for everything else. So it's weird. It's kind of a mismatch for our system. So we have to identify those controls. And honestly, this security objective related consideration is the biggest thing to get through when you're tailoring a control set, because it kind of messes with your mind. And we're going to look at this a little deeper. Is supported by the organizational assessment of risk and does not adversely affect the level of protection for the security relevant information within the information system. So we have to identify those controls that essentially have been misallocated to our baseline because of the high watermark process of identifying a baseline. In many ways, this is why the DoD's implementation of the IC's 3 categorization system is much better, because you never have this problem, because each of the security objectives is rated in the baseline process. So instead of getting a high watermark of high for a system that is has information that is low, low, high, in those environments that high watermark doesn't exist. You would rate the system as low for confidentiality, low for integrity, and high for availability, and you pick the controls based on that. In this case, we end up with a system that is low for confidentiality, low for integrity, but high for availability. That means we have to pick the controls that are high across the board, which means we essentially get everything. So high, moderate, or low ends up being implemented in our baseline. So I know this is a tough one to get your head around, because this is the worst one when we think about how this process happens. So for this one, we're talking about CP2 Enhancement 1, the contingency plan, and we're saying this is downgraded to CP2. So the security objective related consideration, and think about this, while the information system's impact level is moderate, So we're saying the system gets a high level watermark of moderate. The security category for availability is low. So our last objective, CIA, the availability is low. Therefore, CP2 enhancement 1 can be eliminated without impacting the security posture for the information system. CP2 required in the low impact system is sufficient. So we're saying we're taking CP2 enhancement 1 out because we have kind of a mismatch of controls. So we're talking about CP3 as well. Contingency training, none. So we're not tailoring this one out at all, and we're giving rationale why we're not tailoring this while we're tailoring the other one. And this is a security objective-related consideration. The information system's impact level is moderate, and the security category for availability is low. But based on the risk assessment results, the security control is not downgraded and will be implemented within the information system. See our security plan for the details. So we're telling the AO and the control assessor, we're implementing this control. We're good to go with this one. So I broke this down a little bit so that we can think about how this works, because this is the one consideration that gives so many people problems. So an illustrative example is this fake system we've got here. The illustrative system has a confidentiality of moderate, an integrity of low, and an availability of low. But we look at this control they were talking about. CP2 enhancement 1 contingency plan coordinate with related plans. So if we look at confidentiality, there's no requirement to implement this control at any level of confidentiality. If we look at availability, there's no requirement for availability to implement this, but for integrity, it's required at the moderate and high level. So if we look at our integrity is low. So there's, if we're using the DoD or the intelligence community's method, and I apologize, these are out of order. I guess I pulled it from the table this way. The integrity is moderate and high, but because we have this confidentiality level of moderate in our illustrative system, that means it's we have to pull all the controls for moderate confidentiality, moderate integrity, and moderate availability because of the high watermark implementation we're using, right? So we don't have any for confidentiality, we don't have any availability, but for integrity, even though our integrity is low, because we're using the high watermark, we have to select all of the controls with a moderate integrity level. So this is where we end up with this kind of mismatch of controls. This control should have never been applied to our baseline, but now we can go in and define in our tailoring, hey, this shouldn't be here because there's kind of a mismatch when we did the security objective related consideration based on the high watermark system we used for defining which controls would be in our baseline. So if you get through this one, you've made it through the hurdle of all of this. So if this gives you any problems, let me know in the comments below. We'll circle back around and we'll try to take this one on. And we got Mike coming in. Good morning, Mike. Good to see you. So the next thing we do, this is a big one, right? Common control related considerations. We started talking about this a little bit earlier, but there's many more that we can talk about when we're talking about common control sets. So common control related considerations. These are inherited from an approved common control set. That's a mistake there in the slide. They can't be shared between a common control provider and a system. There's a hybrid, right? So we're not talking about hybrid here. And every control in the system SCTM must be addressed. And that's just a note here. That's really not for common controls. That's a note. By the time we're done with this, every single control in our security controls traceability matrix has got to be addressed. We have to look at every single one of them and determine what we're doing with them. Who is going to be implementing each? So in this one, we've got a lot of examples we can look at, right? So AC1, if we know, let me drink some coffee quick. Any of the dash ones we know should be on the top of our list for inheritance. We know all the policies and procedures should be inherited from someone. So AC1, access control policy and procedure. We're going to say right off the bat, AO, security control assessor, this is a common control. And we give them rationale. Common control related consideration. The organization's security policies and procedures document implements this security control. See the Information Security Program Office for assessment results. So we're saying, hey, this is a common control. There's a common control set out there. I am the system owner. I'm inheriting that. Don't even talk to me about this. Go talk to the Information Security Program Office, and they'll give you the information you need. So you're telling the AO, I'm not going to implement this. This is a common control. And you're telling the SCA, you're going to have to do your legwork. Go talk to the program office. Or I might be nice and provide that information when I give them the packet. We're also saying AT3, security training, is a common control. We're telling Common Control-Related Consideration, the Information Security Program Office provides role-based security training that is sufficient for the information systems users. And again, see the Information Security Program Office for assessment results. It's not my problem. It's a common control. It's in an approved common control set. I'm not dealing with it. I'm taking it out of, I'm not essentially taking it out. I'm not implementing it at the system level. We don't take any of these out of the common control set. And we don't take any of these out of the SCTM, by the way. We note them and we leave them in place. Even the controls we're removing, we note it in the SCTM and we leave it there, right? We have to have that record, that traceability of what we did with each of these controls. And then the last one we're talking about common control, AT4, security training records. As you can understand, if AT3 is being provided by the same people, AT4 is going to keep track of them, right? AO, SCA, common control. This is a common control related consideration. The Information Security Program Office provides training record tool that manages organizational training records. Go see them. This is an inherited control. I'm not dealing with it. It's for them to deal with. And that's what we do with, that's what we're doing with common controls. Now there's hybrid controls we need to think about too, where part of it is done by a common control provider and part of it is done by the system. And that's what we're talking about here. CP2 is a contingency plan, and we're tailoring this one as a hybrid control. So we're telling the AO and we're telling the SCA this is a hybrid control. So we have to go look at the rationale. This is a common control related consideration. The Information Security Program Office provides training on how to develop an information system contingency plan, and they provide a standard template for all systems within the organization. So we've defined in the rationale, this is the part of the control you're going to have to go talk to the Security Program Office for. Then we're going to tell them the contingency plan template is completed by the information system owner as part of the security documentation for the information system. So we're saying, hey, that second part, completing the template, doing the legwork on the template, we do that. So come see us for that part. But if you're talking about the training, if you're talking about how the template looks, any of those questions, take that to the Security Program Office. It's not my fish to fry. That's for them to take care of. Go ask them. If you have problems with the way it was filled out or the way we did it, that's another thing. That's at the system level. So, and no, this is a rough one, guys. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in this one. So, some controls, we're talking about system component allocation-related considerations, allocation-related. So some components, let me back up a little bit, take a break there. Some controls are only applicable to specific components of the information system. Implementing on different parts of the system will not increase security. So we're saying we have to put a control in place, but it's only required in a certain part of the system. If we put it everywhere, it's going to increase the cost, but it's not going to make us more secure. So it doesn't make sense to put it anywhere but that one component where it's required. This may not be known during initial development of the system and may be refined during the implementation step as we go on to the next step and identify those controls that are not applicable. So we go back to our control set again. We know already that we're not going to have IA3 on the web servers, right? So device identification and authentication, this is an organization-defined parameters. That's the tailoring we're going to do in a minute here. And the assignment we're assigning that to the web servers. We already talked about IA3, so we'll add that information to the information already in the rationale. IA4, identifier management, that's component level. We talked about this, right? It's a public access related consideration. The requirement for security control identifier does not apply to those information system users that are accessing the public website to obtain publicly available information. We already talked about that one, right? PE14, temperature and humidity controls, right? Operational environment related consideration. Temperature and humidity controls, not. So they were talking about all of those components where we're not applying a control, or any component where we're specifically applying a control only. So in this case, we're saying at the component level for these 4 controls, we're not going to implement them. So don't look for IA3 at the web servers. Don't look for IA4 at the web servers. Don't look for PE 14 and 15 at these remote sensors, because first of all, AO, we're asking to tailor those out at those places, and SCA, when you go to look at them, they're not going to be there. You're not going to be able to find a finding because we're getting them tailored out. So IA3 still applies for the rest of the system, just not for the public site of the web server, right? So, scalability-related considerations. We all think about these too. This is guided by the system's impact level. For more detail for higher impact systems, it's at the organization's discretion, and we identify those controls that are not applicable, right? So this is scalability-related. We have a finite level of resources, and we're going to have more detail on those systems that have a higher impact to our organization than the than lower impact systems, right? So we have to identify these as well, right? And that's they really can't apply that to our control set because that's applied at a system by system level. So when we get to this point, we have to make sure that all of these things are getting documented into the security plan. It's either an attachment to the security plan, or maybe it's actually within the security plan, and every control's got to be counted for, right? So we go into this next step. There's 3 terms we have to know: a compensating control, a mitigating control, and a supplementing control. And a lot of times people use these interchangeable, and we can't when we go forward, right? So compensating control is a security and privacy control implemented in lieu of controls in the baseline described in the NIST publication, Special Publication 853, that provide equivalent or comparable protection for an organization, system or organization. So a compensating control, we can't put a control in place, so we're going to put another control in place that provides about the same level of protection. A mitigating control, on the other hand, mitigating controls are put in place to reduce either the probability or the consequences of a threat. So we add them to a control, right? We add them to the set. Well, it's to help mitigate or reduce the probability of something happening. So we're not saying, in the first case, we're saying, hey, I can't put this control in place. I'm going to put another one in place instead of it. In this case, we're not saying the control is going to be in place. And it may not have anything to do with reducing the threat provided the defense of that control, but this is going to help mitigate overall threat. And then finally, the supplementing control are put in place to supplement a control that's not fully effective in reducing the risk introduced by a vulnerability, right? So in this case, we have the control in place, and it may be fully in place, but it doesn't provide the protection that we need. Or it may be that we have the control in place and we can't fully implement it, so we have to supplement it with another control. So these 3 terms, try not to use them interchangeable. Compensating control, we can't put a control in place, so we put another one in place. Mitigating control, we're putting another control in place. We're adding a control to our control set to reduce probability. And a supplementing control is we're supplementing a control that cannot fully reduce the risk, right? So determining the need for compensating controls, we have to analyze security controls we have in place. We have to select the compensating control, and then we have to document the compensating control, right? So we analyze, first part, analyze security controls. Controls and part of controls are analyzed to ensure they can be implemented. Implementation may not be possible due to cost or technical limitations. And the system owner determines alternate methods or actions. So compensating controls, equivalent controls, additional controls. Kind of what we talked about in the first part there, our definition slide. So every attempt should be made to select a compensating control from the NIST catalog. And organizations formally accept the risk of using a compensating control. Remember, you use this instead of the control that's required. Document the compensating control in the spreadsheet or security plan. The compensating control and identifying control numbers are documented. So let's jump in and look at one of these in our control set, right? So PE2 Enhancement 1, Physical Access Control. We're saying this is a compensating control. This control was added to compensate for SI11 error handling. So when we put PE2 in, we've added a control. So to this point, we've been removing controls. Now we're adding a compensating control. So we look at SI11 error handling. We're saying also there, compensating control. And then the rationale, we provide the reason why we can't do this control. Remember, this is why compensating controls is a control we can't do. So we're doing SI11 instead, or excuse me, PE2 Enhancement 1 instead. So our rationale, it's infeasible to implement error handling capability in the information system due to the development cost to add this capability to a 17-year-old information system. This capability is planned for a placement system that is expected to be operational within the next 2 years. Equivalent security is provided by PE2 Enhancement 1, Physical Access Control, where the physical access to the information system components are restricted in addition to the physical security restrictions at the facility. So if you think about this, when you look at it at face value, you may be like, how is a PE, a physical and environmental control, compensating for this error handling control? And really, SI11 talks about not displaying the error message on the screen. So in this system, it's so old that we can't suppress the error messages. They're going to show up on the screen regardless. So what we do is we keep people away from the system so they can't see the screen. So that's how this is a compensating control. It doesn't stop the system from displaying the message. It's still going to display the error message on the screen. But the bad guy hopefully can't get to the screen to see it. That's how this one works. So it's compensating. So determine organizationally defined parameters. Something we have to do. We have to see if are those parameters, do they make sense for the information system? Identify opportunity for assignments and selection. Identify choices for parameter assignments and selections, and then document the assignments and selections. So if we look at 853, the control catalog, a lot of the controls have square brackets, and I used to know how many, but now that we've got the revision 5 out, I'm not sure how many assignment values they are. So it's things like the organization defines a password that is, and then there's going to be square brackets, and it's going to say organizationally defined parameters, characters long. So we're giving the organization, as NIST, they're giving the organization the ability to define how long that parameter is. So every control is reviewed to determine its assignment or selection. The information system owner determines what has to be signed or selected. The information owner determines adequate protection for the system. So we're going to get a lot of these from the organization. The organization should have defined many of these parameters already. All the information system owner needs to do is see if there's any remaining that they have to assign, and then determine if the requirement that is set by the organization meets the security level for the system. So system owner can always make these parameters higher, more stringent. They can't ever make them less stringent, really. So the Information Security Program Office may determine variables to ensure consistency across the organization. If the variables are not assigned by the Information Security Program Office, it's the responsibility of the system owner using a checklist or NIST guidance or other sorts of input. You got to go through, and these variables have to be defined so you know how to develop the system. So we have to document assignments and selections. We use a spreadsheet for or security plans to update the assignments. So if the tailored baseline is not sufficient to meet the needs of the information system, the information system owner can add supplemental controls. Those are controls, again, we talked about earlier, that add to the baseline. We're almost back to the control list, guys. The information system owner determines additional controls from Appendix S of NIST Special Publication 853. If additional or compensating controls cannot be identified to effectively protect the information system, use restrictions should be considered. And use restrictions like, I can only use the system from 8 to 5 because we have more people in the Security Operations Center, or it can only be used from October through the end of the month or end of the year. We put restrictions on it, right? These are used when organizations cannot apply sufficient security controls to reduce or mitigate the risk. this may be the only practical or reasonable course of action to carry out the unassigned mission. So, supplement security controls are added to the worksheet or as a system security plan, and this represents the final selected security controls. So, we go through. We have supplementary security controls, AU10 Enhancement 1, non-repudiation. This is a supplemental control we're adding. Based on the risk assessment, this control is added to the baseline. This information supports law enforcement activities, and specific actions with the information system must be logged and reviewed. So we're saying, because this is a law enforcement system, I've got to add AU10 Enhancement 1. And then I'm also adding AU12 Supply Chain Protection, and we're saying it's a supplemental control. Based on the risk assessment, this control is added to the baseline. This information system supports law enforcement activities and requires the information technology products within the system be from known and approved sources. So 2 controls we're adding to drive down risk. They weren't required in the baseline, but we're adding them. They're not taking the place of another control. They're not enhancing a control that can't be fully implemented. We're supplementing the control set. So in the end, no row should look like this. No row should be blank. They should all have information filled out in them. And when we look at these things, we have areas, and I thought we talked about, let's escape out of this real quick. So we look here, we see places where we have things like organizationally defined parameter. This is what we talked about here. Yeah, so we have an assignment every 2 years. So we've added that assignment to CP3, right? Organizationally defined parameters. We've added the assignment to web servers. And we'll get into this a lot more when we take a look at 853. So this was a quick walk through how your control set should look. So at the end of tailoring, this is what your control set should look like. Every single one of those controls should be looked at, and we should never have a row, never have a row that looks like this last row down here. This last row is wrong. If you have one of these, you have to go through, you got to find it, and you got to stomp it out. So, I know we went long this morning. I know it was a long run. I know it was. I'm glad you guys hung out. But now it's time to get to work, right? We have to get out there, take care of your friends, your family, your coworkers. Take care of each other. We got a long road ahead. Tomorrow we're going to talk about NIST Special Publication 853 Bravo. So join us 7:30 a.m. right here, Cup of Cyber, as we look at this new format. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know how you feel about tailoring controls now that we went through this. With that being said, like Mike Bravo and Sierra Bravo say, go get some. Take care of your friends, your family, your coworkers, and I will see you tomorrow, 7:30 a.m.